In this video, I'm going to discuss the difference between anonymity and confidentiality, two concepts that are very important to look at when we talk about data ethics and conducting a morally ethical experiment or conducting a survey where the results are really more important than the actual people who answer them. So when I think of anonymous and confidential, I think of two of my favorite TV shows, two different ends of the spectrum in both of these shows. I think of Family Feud and I think of The Sopranos. And you may be thinking, well, it's a little odd to be thinking of those two shows when you think of anonymous and confidentiality, but I'll explain why in a minute. So I'm actually going to start with confidentiality over here to the right because I like The Sopranos more, and it's one of my favorite TV shows. And for those of you unfamiliar with the show, this young man in the picture here, his name is Uncle Junior, and Uncle Junior is the Don of the Soprano crime family, and you're probably still asking yourself, well, what does this have to do with confidentiality? If you look closely at this picture, in the upper left hand corner, you're going to see the vascular system and a diagram that goes along with it. Not to mention the beautifully colored, looks like a light green wall there with a landline. It looks very, very similar to what you would find in a doctor's office, and that's indeed what it is. It's a doctor's office that Uncle Junior finds himself in this scene and many scenes during the first and second season of the show. Again, now why would the Don of a crime family be in a doctor's office if it weren't for his own health? And obviously, he does have some health issues, but the reason he goes into the doctor's office is to conduct business with his associates. And when we talk about business, he's breaking the law. Money laundering and extortion and all those good things that the mafia takes a part in. He conducts these business deals and these conversations in the doctor's office. Okay, now why would he do this? Think about it. Why would he want to conduct any time he's talking about something where he's breaking the law in a doctor's office, whom he's probably paying on the side at least once every 2 weeks with some nice cash? And the reason is there's a little something called the doctor-client privilege, which basically means that if anything is shared in a doctor's office to a doctor, that information is very, very confidential, and it can't be used it can't be used against someone in court. It can't be used against the client in court. So by law, the doctor, if he overhears that they're having this conversation about breaking the law, he could not be used to testify in court. So again, Uncle Junior uses that room because he knows that anything he talks about there is confidential. Okay. A more concrete way to think about it is it doesn't matter who is in the room, whether it's one person, two people, three people, 10 people, whatever is talked about in that room does not leave that room. Okay, so another way to think about confidentiality is Vegas. The old saying, what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. What happens in this room stays in this room. It's confidential. It's not necessarily anonymous because, again, we look at this picture, we look at this man, and I know it's Uncle Junior. Okay, I'm not questioning what his identity is. I know that it is Uncle Junior. Okay. Another way to think about it, even if you are not sure of the person who it is, um, another way to explain it, when I think of confidentiality, I think of a code. Okay. And what I mean by a code is, did you ever get test results on, let's say, a midterm exam where your professor or your teacher posts a list of everybody and what they got on that exam? But instead of putting the names, they put your student ID number. Okay, so say for example, there's 25 students in the class, and you are ID number 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, you know that's your ID number. The professor knows that it's your ID number, so you can still be linked to that number and that score. Okay, that's another way to keep information confidential between one party and the other. In that case, between the student and the teacher. All right, it is confidential because, again, your name can be linked to that score, but no one else knows aside from the people in that quote unquote room or in that grading process, namely the professor and the teacher. Okay, now let's talk about anonymity. All right, anonymity kind of takes confidentiality a step further. Let's go back to that example of taking the test and looking at the class roster in terms of an ID and the scores. And let's say, for example, that teacher had no idea what your student ID number was. In fact, he gave the test to his teaching assistant or another teacher, and he asked them to grade the test. And they were the ones who linked the student ID number to the scores. And he looked at that roster. He or she looked at that roster and had no clue where those scores came from. Didn't know the ID numbers. All right, but simply given that list, calculated an average, and then reported that average to, say, the department chair. Okay, and said, hey, on my midterm exam, my students averaged a score of an 88%. That number is anonymous, but it's not confidential. All right, think about it. It's anonymous because he doesn't know the individuals that built that number. He has no idea where it comes from. Yet it's not confidential because he's broadcasting that 88% to a department chair. He may publish it in a brochure that explains this is why you should take this course next year. So when I think of anonymous, I think of this word broadcast. All right, and not necessarily a radio broadcast, but we're sharing the information out. Okay, but yet we're still not sure where it came from. Okay, so enter Family Feud. In Family Feud, they have 100 people respond to a survey, giving items that would most likely answer a question. And I'm not even sure what the question is for this picture here, but you have 58 people who answered a meeting center, 34 people who answered a training center, and then 8 people answered an event center. So where that breakdown comes from, I have no idea. If I have a group of 100 people that I ask this question to, the 58 here that answered meeting center, as the person conducting that survey, I have no means of figuring out who said meeting center. I have no means of figuring out which 8 people picked event center and which 34 people picked training center. Yet, I'm taking that anonymous information and I'm broadcasting it out for not just the people on the show, not just for Steve Harvey, but for everybody tuning in to watch this show. So the information is spread rampantly, unlike in a confidential situation where it's not broadcasted. So I think of broadcast. Another word to think of is this word blind. All right, and we've used this word before in experiments. When we talk about a double-blind experiment, it's when neither the subjects know whether they're receiving treatment or not, and also the person conducting the experiment has no idea who's receiving the treatment and who is not. Very similar concept here. If something's anonymous, as the person conducting the survey, as the person conducting the conversation, as the person conducting the interview, I have no idea where that information is coming from. All right. One last example for those of you who had a Catholic upbringing like myself, when you have the sacrament of confession, you go in to talk to the priest, and you have that option to put that screen in front of you, and you confess your sins, and that priest has no knowledge of who's sharing that information. Okay, quick question: the confessional, is that anonymous or is it confidential? The answer: it's both. Okay, when you go into that confessional, the screen is up. As the priest, I have no idea who is telling me this information, and it's confidential because that information does not leave the room.